Dear members of 𝗕𝗂𝗄𝗃, good morning to you and welcome to the fourth director briefing of this year. And this time we are going to talk about the topic is called Building 21st Century Companies in Asia. And this is a very interesting topic because in order for us business in Asia to go forward and to win, Asia landscape has been very competitive right now and will be more competitive in future. So with this, how are we going to win? How can we even reimagine the word winning? So for this, we are very fortunate to have with us the two speakers. But before we introduce them, I would like to inform you that you will be asked to put on mute. But if you want to have questions, please go to chat and send your question to all panelists for Q&A. And please do so. It will make this session very helpful for yourself and others. So this morning we have guests, and before we talk about the guests, I would like to thank again to McKinsey for providing us the thought leadership in the past and today. So the first one is Mr. Jeongmin Seong, partner, McKinsey Global Institute, and the second one is Kevin Russell, senior fellow, McKinsey Global Institute. Hello. Hi, Jeongmin. Hello, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you? Thank you for inviting us.
And Kevin, it might be late for you, right?
It is, but it's a pleasure to be here, and really thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So this with this, we have about 1 hour. And then we will start with your presentation. What do you mean by building the 21st century company and in Asia? What does it mean by that? So maybe you can spend half an hour or 45 minutes and talking about that. And then while you're doing that, we can have a chat too, okay? So who will want to start first? Kevin, right?
Yep, I will be starting first. Thank you very much. And just by way of introduction, so I've been at McKinsey for 7 years. The first half of that, I was based in Southeast Asia. So worked in Jakarta and Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore for about 4 years in the banking practice. I have a PhD in political economy and worked for 6 years in policy. So my research focuses now at the McKinsey Global Institute on the role of companies, the growth and competition side, as well as their impact and role in society. And what I'm going to talk about today is really how those two things come together. So I'm going to share a bit of a presentation with some slides, but they'll hopefully be quite simple. So let me put it in presentation mode here. So I'm going to be talking about companies in the 21st century and what we mean by that, and especially the way that societal expectations are shaping that. So I'm going to make 4 points. The first is that what stakeholders and society think of behavior of companies matters more now in this 21st century than perhaps last century. The second is that that's only one piece of why the competitive landscape is getting more complex, more challenging, but also more rewarding for the companies that do succeed. The third is with those new challenges, companies need to ask new questions, in particular around what their purpose is and who really benefits from their activities. And that one in particular is supposed to be a point that is quite open for discussion. So I expect some interruptions and questions on that one. And then fourth and last is how you answer those questions will really depend on what type of company you are. And so we've done quite a bit of research on a database of all of the large companies over $1 billion of revenue in OECD economies 5,000 companies to answer that question. I'll also say a little bit about non-OECD companies. But the second half of our presentation is all about then what are the priorities for the companies in Asia specifically, and Jeongmin will share research findings around that. So the first point I want to make is really that what companies do and how they behave matters more in terms of society and stakeholders than it might have in the past. So the first number I want to share here, and these are all from public data from the Edelman Trust Survey that anybody can look at, 2022 document, is that over half of the respondents in the 27 largest economies in the world, to include Thailand and Indonesia and a lot of the Asian economies, believe that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. That's not a 20th century message, at least not at the end of the 20th century. But what I want to point out is that this is not so much a rejection of capitalism as a shift in expectations for companies. So the point on the bottom left here is that if you ask people how they think of companies in terms of their beliefs and values, about 60% would say that they buy or advocate a brand based on their beliefs and values about a company. Where they choose to work is really based on that. And investors are now overwhelmingly looking at what kind of role do companies play in society. And then furthermore, on the right-hand side, you see here, 80% believe that CEOs should be personally visible when discussing public policy and stakeholders and the work that their company does to benefit society. And then the last point on this page, on the bottom right there, you see a chart of which issues stakeholders in society expect companies to have an impact on. And there you see the ones that really, there is actually a correlation with where they have the most impact. So jobs in the economy, right? Technology, wages, those are all about workforce type issues. Climate change now is of course on the agenda for almost every company. And while companies are getting pulled into politics more, that actually is a much lower thing on the list. So perhaps good news in that, yes, stakeholders are asking more of companies, but actually in the areas where companies can actually have an impact and can have a role that is under their control to some extent. But the second point I want to make of my 4 points is that's just one reason or one shift in the competitive landscape in the 21st century. And when we talk about 21st century companies, what we really mean is again, winning in the 21st century, which on the first hand is about taking advantage of the new opportunities. And this is very generalized, but of course, technology shifts have opened up far more opportunity for companies. Rising global prosperity, which is especially true in the Asian context compared to how big markets were and where you could sell, how much you could sell compared to last century. And of course, globalization, which we may now talk about perhaps being in retreat to some extent, but again, if you compare it to last century, is much more connected around the world. All of these things make it in many ways a better time to be a large leading company than there has ever been. But what about the challenges? So some of these challenges are really connected to those opportunities. Technology is creating profits and impact. It also now is raising concerns of misinformation in society, misuse, privacy issues. When it comes to more prosperity, those gains are really getting concentrated in what we sometimes call these superstar effects, right? Some companies getting all of the benefits. So that actually makes the competitive landscape even more challenging. Global companies have certain benefits, but now if you're operating across borders in many, many different localities, how do you make sure that your brand is both staying cohesive at the same time that you're responding to local regulations, to norms, to culture? Those complexities are a challenge. And then lastly, there's a set of challenges that are a little bit unrelated to what companies do every day, but are still issues that are creating new questions for companies. Inequality and that we see, which is especially grown in my home country of the United States, but is also seen in all over the world. New expectations, which is what I was just talking about on the last page. sustainability and climate change. Again, every company now has to think about that question. And lastly, geopolitics and complexities, which unfortunately has gotten even more complicated in the last month or two with the conflict in Ukraine. So this picture now is really beyond just one shift, right? So how do we make sense of how a company can succeed where this is the landscape, right? So I want to start with a few questions that companies can ask. And we have a list of 10. I'm going to only focus on 4 because we don't have time for all. But let me start with what is the company's mission and purpose. This is also a priority for Asian companies. As Jeongmin is going to talk about 5 priorities, and this is in fact one of them. But what is the societal purpose that a company has? Why? Given that we know stakeholders in society are asking these questions of company, what is that company's answer? How far should we go towards responding to stakeholders beyond still the primary, or at least a primary goal of creating long-term profits for shareholders? And the third, who actually does benefit from a company? It sounds like such a simple question. This is the one that I want to show some of our research findings in the second part of my discussion just now. And then the last one, over what time horizon? So a lot of the questions that we ask are really about, for example, climate change. Most of the benefits from climate change are still decades off in terms of avoiding real damage. Of course, they've started already, but the really big benefits are later. So how do we balance that against the short-term necessities of delivering on other goals, right? So I'm highlighting these because they're really general values questions. You can then ask questions about each stakeholder individually, and that's what the rest of the questions are, which I'll flash up on the screen here. But I'm then going to focus mainly on this question of who benefits and show what our research shows about how companies do impact households and why that's important for business success, right? The question that we started with. So some of these other questions that are on the workforce, technology and data, how to handle it ethically, how do we get inclusion and diversity, which has especially been a focus of companies in the US recently, societal impact of business, including for companies that with consumer goods, and then new forms of company like platforms, which are now responsible for people that use their platforms. That was not a question that we asked in the last century so much. And then this point about how to balance global and local imperatives that I was mentioning. So I've highlighted the 4 in blue there because I think they're really the ones that to start with. They're basically, what is your compass, your values compass as a company, and who really depends on the company's success. So those 3 areas that I've mentioned so far, that societal impact matters more, that it's only one piece of the competitive landscape, and that companies need to ask new questions, right? Those are that's sort of a mindset for a 21st century company about how to succeed. I now want to share some research findings that look over the last 25 years about how companies have actually impacted society and the economy. And of course, if anybody does have questions along the way, as Kulvech had said, please put them in the queue.
Let me summarize what you just mentioned. I think the key word that you said is the shift of expectation, the stakeholder expectation, and they want they don't want to know how much you earn, but how you earn.
Yes, and that in turn will affect how much you earn in the long term. Yes, I think that's right.
Exactly. So how you earn impact how much you earn in the long term.
Yeah.
And they even want to know your societal positioning. Right? Okay. Okay. This is not the end of the presentation. There's still some more. But my question, which can be discussed later on, is what does the board and the management have to work together to address these four issues. How do they work together? But before that, anything else you would like to add? Or Jeongmin has some presentation, right?
Yeah, no, I'm going to show the one more bit about the actual impact of companies on the economy, because I think before we can answer these questions about what should companies do, we need a really clear picture of what they already do, right? And I think the first point to make is that companies contribute tremendously to the well-being of society. The very first thing that they do is create incomes and create products for the economy. And in about 75% of economic income comes from business in modern economies, right? But where does that actually go? And that's the question that we started with when we did this research. And we have a database of every large company, meaning a company over $1 billion, so quite large, in the OECD economies is where we did the initial research, right? And that's about 80% of the global economy. Those companies account for $40 trillion in revenue every year. And so the question we asked is, where does each dollar of revenue actually go on average, right? And this is the starting point. And so of that $1, we start with these four pathways. And these are the four pathways that contribute directly to GDP, right? They go directly to households or to government through taxes. So 4 cents of every dollar is going to government, both as corporate income tax and as production taxes and other forms of payment. 6 cents is going to retained by the company that gets reinvested, and that's how capital investments happen, right? 7 cents is going to capital income. This is dividends and share buybacks and actual cash flows to shareholders, right? And 25 cents going to labor income. And this picture is actually for domestic economies in OECD countries. In non-OECD countries, that labor income is actually quite a bit lower. We don't have a precise estimate, but in some countries, it's actually even half of that. Now, this only adds up to about 42 cents. So where does the rest of that dollar go? Well, the answer is, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. The answer is that it goes to input costs, right? To your supplier and your business ecosystem, right? Every business has a set of partners. A lot of their costs are going there, 58 cents on the dollar. Now that in turn then goes to other labor income and to workers, and that eventually reaches households as well. But if we think about who does a company really impact, and what relationships need to be creating joint value between the company and its stakeholders? Suppliers and the business ecosystem is actually the biggest group in a lot of ways. Now, this isn't all of the pathways. This is 5 pathways. We also have to think about the consumer, and this is much harder to estimate how much you benefit consumers, and it ranges widely for each company. But we did some estimates, based on how much more willing to pay as a consumer in a transaction than what they actually paid. And that extra benefit is essentially surplus to that consumer. And it's at least as big as these other pathways. And we estimated it at about 40 cents on the dollar. And then lastly, there's much more than financial impact, right? We asked the question, where does the dollar go? But we should keep in mind that there's many non-financial benefits, and a lot of the ESG or environment, social, and governance indicators are about those. Climate impact, for example, is one of the biggest ones. But by having this picture, we can start to say, all right, how does a company respond to these shifting expectations? Well, you need to know at least where your starting point is. Now, I'm sure many people in our audience are saying, well, that's fine. That's what an average company looks like, but every company is very different, right? It really depends on what type of company you are to be able to say, how am I creating value? How do that impact of that value change and eventually impact my own business? Now, we again said that while we don't actually have a good framework for thinking about that question, we have sectors, right? You could think about companies being different by sector, but we weren't sure, like, how do sectors impact households, right? So we created a whole new basically a way of grouping companies where we said, how does the way you create value connect with the impact that you have? And so we said, okay, we have a big database with 5,000 companies in it, and it shows how much R&D spending they have, what kind of capital they have, how big the labor force is, how they create value on the one hand, and then we also know how much profit or how much compensation for workers and how much impact on suppliers. Where does that go? And we did an algorithm, and it basically showed us that there's really 8 types of 21st century companies, right? 8 ways in which companies create value that then benefits economy and stakeholders. And they're listed here on the page, and I'll just quickly mention them. We don't have a lot of time to dig into them, although we're happy to answer questions about it. But we gave them labels, right, so that they're memorable and they really describe what kind of a company they are. So Discover, which is the kind of company that is doing a lot of scientific research, right? And they take a lot of risks, but as a result of that, they tend to have very high profits. And this is like your pharmaceutical companies, for example. And they're only 4% of the total revenue of all companies. The second is a technologist, which again are also investing a lot in R&D, taking a lot of risks. They also tend to have higher profits as a result. But what differentiates them is that they've actually pushed prices down for consumers a lot. And if you think about technology goods in our homes and what we use every day, what we're using right now, prices have just tremendously decreased since the beginning of the century. And so that's how they impact society, is through this consumer benefit heavily. The third one, which is experts, which is companies that really rely on human capital and to specialize and to, for example, in healthcare or professional services or in education. And that model is really contributing quite high wages to that group, but then also pushing productivity for the whole economy because they have such high skills and high human capital. Those 3 are really the ones that are kind of pushing the productivity frontier. The next 3 here, the delivers, makers, and builders, they're the companies that really make the world go round, right? So the delivers are companies with big employment, like retailers. They have many customer touch points, and those are going to be the 2 areas where they really have to have effective stakeholder relationships to create value. Makers are your bigger manufacturers. They actually have a big impact in terms of wages on a whole economy. Builders are the ones that have heavy infrastructure. They operate telcos, utilities, and they tend to be really important for the economy run. And the last 2, fuelers, which is your sort of natural resource energy companies, and financiers, are the ones that enable the economy through energy and finance. And that's that way they have the biggest impact on the most people and on the most households, is as enablers. Now, we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but it's a little bit of a novel way of grouping companies together. But what we're basically saying here is that companies do different things in this century. So we need a new way of kind of grouping them together. Now, the last point I'm going to make, and I'll turn it over to Jeongmin about the priorities for Asian companies, in this context, is what does the landscape look like in Asia? Now, these are bar charts of 1990s versus today of the different types of companies that I just explained. And I'll draw your attention to just 1 or 2 points, which is number 5, the green one, the makers. These are your auto manufacturers. These are companies that tend to employ a lot of people at quite good wages because they're also exporting these goods. And especially in Asian economies, this has been super important. And yet you see, if we look at the advanced Asia economies on the left, this is mainly Japan and Korea, by the way. They used to make up a huge, over half the revenue, right? And now it's still a very big part, but it's down to 42%. Similarly, if you look at the US, you see a decrease from 29% down to 17%. Now, China was increasing during this period, right? And we all know a manufacturing story in China over the last 2 decades, but this is showing just how important it was for especially large companies there to see an increase and to pay many workers and to see a real lift in the middle class because of the role of large companies. And that's one of the storylines here that we could point out. I'll also just mention, the technologists, discoverers, and experts, which are quite a big share in the US are not as big, for example, in emerging Asia, which you'd expect that, right? As an economy grows and goes into higher income, you'll see more and more there. China already has a lot of technologists, as we all know, that have been very important as well, and have grown quite a bit since the 1990s. So I just want to conclude again with the 4 points that I set out to say, right? That it matters now more to companies what their role in society is. That's only one element of the landscape, right? That there's all these other factors that I showed earlier that shape the competitive landscape. And so it's especially important in that context to figure out, what is my role as a company? What kind of an impact do I want to have? And then lastly, to show that it really matters what type of a company you are to answer that question. So I hope that has been helpful and interesting. I'm happy to answer questions either now or otherwise I'll hand to Jeongmin, because I think we really want to show what the Asian story is here.
Thank you, Kevin. Please, Jeongmin.
Yeah, so Kevin talked about the shifting context and the expectation on the companies, and let's talk more about the Asia. So probably I'm better positioned to talk about Asia because I'm Korean, but I've been working in China for the past 17 years. I'm currently in Shanghai on the lockdown, so I normally look better than I look today. I haven't had my haircut quite a while, but hopefully I still look okay. And back to your question, �𝗂𝗏, right? You talked about what should CEOs and board of directors need to do, right? And here are the 5 priorities that we thought about, right? So Kevin, if you go to the next page, the 5 keywords, right? So the first is about data and technology. Second is about sustainability. Third about scale. Fourth about organizational speed and agility. And fifth about purpose, right? So we think that these are the 5 priorities. And by the way, God gave me a special capability to read people's mind, and I know what you are thinking, right? So this keyword, sounds good, right? But then, they are relevant to all the CEOs, right, in the world, right? Why Asia? And our view is that, arguably, they matter more to CEOs and board in Asia, right? And let's talk about it. For example, number 1, capitalize the power of data and technology. It matters more in Asia because there's a lot more leapfrogging opportunity in Asia. Economy is a lot more fluid, and there is a lot more scope to shape as a company, as a corporate executive leader and director. Second, scaling the sustainability and growth circle. It matters more to Asia because Asia is simply more exposed to the risks, right? So, for example, physical climate risk, Asia is more exposed to those risks than any other parts of the world, right? That means there is bigger value at stake, right, that we need to tackle. Number 3, creating scale. It matters more to Asia because Asia is a high growth economy. Therefore, there is a bigger reward for winners if you can scale up fast. And number 4, put speed and agility at the center of organization. It matters more to Asian companies because leadership is highly contested, right? It's very dynamic environment, as 𝗂𝗏𝗏 said in the beginning, right? So therefore, the need for speed and agility is much greater. And number 5, leave the purpose, right? So increasing number of consumers and investors and employees are paying attention to this, right? So therefore, the scope for change, right, will be arguably greater in Asia, right? So these are the 5 priorities, and let me just quickly talk through one by one. Next slide on number 1, right? On data and tech, right? So Asia has already risen, right? And then it is already the largest economic bloc in the world. Kevin, if you go to the next page. So people tend to think of Asia as a factory of the world, but then the role of Asia has been evolving, especially related to the innovation. So while you are figuring out tech issue, let me just keep talking. Okay. So right, This page, yes. So, the role of tech and data, right? Asia's role in the global economy is evolving. It's not just a factory of the world. Asia is becoming an innovation hub as well, right? So if you look at these indicators, more than half of tech company revenue, R&D expenditure, and majority of the patent growth is coming from Asia. 40% of global unicorns are from Asia. Top 5 out of 10, large tech firms are from Asia, right? So and that is also because, right? So Asian consumers are highly adaptable to the changes. And for example, if you take digital as an example, right? So Asian consumers are enthusiastic users of many digital services. And in China, we use WeChat, right? And average time people spending on WeChat is more than an hour. It's not just for social messaging. You can order food, call taxi, pay utility bill, watch entertainment programs, show health record, and so on, right? So the so-called the rise of super app phenomenon is a lot more prevalent in Asia, right? And in Southeast Asia, right? So you'll see similar super apps, whether Gojek or Grab or Kakao in Korea, for example, right? So that means there will be also a lot of data getting generated in Asia, right? So and they say that data is the new oil, right? Or the new blood, right, of the economy, right? So and also Asian consumers are willing to share their data in return for practical benefit, right? For example, personalization services. So there's a lot more room to continue to innovate, right, and drive innovation out of Asia. So that is number one. Second priority is about scaling the sustainability and the growth circle. Kevin, if you go to the next page. And it is a difficult task, right? Especially for the CEOs and the previous page, number 2. Because, right? So in the Western economy, they already went through the development cycle, and yes, sustainability matters. But in Asia, CEOs, right, need to balance the conflicting goal, right? On the one hand, yes, sustainability matters. On the other hand, accelerating the growth, getting people out of poverty, creating jobs, they matter, right? So therefore, the challenge arguably is bigger, right? But then let's also think about the downside of not taking actions, right? And this is our assessment on the Asia's exposure to physical climate risk, right? So and if you, especially the livability and workability and physical assets and infrastructure, Asia accounts for 75% of the global risk exposure, right? Because Asian work activities, there are a lot more outdoor activities, right, in the production site or construction site, right? So therefore, they are more vulnerable to lethal heat waves, for example. Asian factories and infrastructure, they are more vulnerable to floods, right, and all those natural disasters, for example, right? So arguably, bigger value at stake, therefore, bigger priorities for Asian CEOs. We talked about leapfrogging in the innovation space, then there's also leapfrogging opportunities for Asia in this space. So that is the second priority. Next page is the third priority, which is creating a scale, right? So Kevin, if you move to number 3, so scale matters to everyone, and then the traditional Asian playbook is to grow scale through organic approach or alliance or coalition building, which is great, right? Which continue to matter, right? But then one thing that Asian CEOs and boards of directors can pay attention to is how to strengthen the M&A capability in addition to those traditional approach, right? Because M&A matters more and more, right? And especially for Asian companies to go global, expand geographic scope, and also strengthen the capabilities that they don't have, right? So M&A will become increasingly important. And some CEOs say, this is becoming a necessity for many Asian companies. But then if you look at where Asia stands in terms of M&A, Asia is underrepresented. If you look at the left-hand side, in terms of the number of acquisitions that Asian companies make among these, large 2,000 companies, it is only 0.7 compared to 1.7 or 1.8 in North America and Europe. And then also, M&A is difficult to do, right? So not all marriages are successful, right? So are M&As, right? So one particular type of M&A turned out to be very effective according to our research, which is so-called programmatic M&A, right? So which means conducting a series of moderate-sized deal, then that is tied to the clear strategy, as opposed to a big bang deal, mega deal, or infrequent small-sized deals, right? And they tend to generate bigger return to shareholder. And if you look at the companies engaging in this programmatic M&A, it is also much less in Asia, just 6% compared to around 20% in North America and Europe. Therefore, think about how to strengthen this M&A capabilities. That could be the third priority in terms of scaling up. And the next priority, Kevin, if you go to the next page, is about the putting speed and agility at the center of organization, right? So, and this is why, right? So we analyze the performance of the big companies, right? The 5,000 big companies in Asia, and calculated the probability of staying in the top over a decade, right? And there was about 46%, globally, but then the probability of staying in the top is much lower in Asia. If you look at the right-hand side, in North America, it is about 53%. In China, 36%. Emerging Asia, right, where Thailand is part of, is 33%, right? So this shows that leadership is highly contested in Asia. Once you become a king or queen, right, you enjoy a very big return. But then the weight of that crown is much heavier in Asia, right? So therefore, you need to have a very strong neck and keep training your muscle around your neck, right, to sustain the weight of the crown. And one way to do it is through your organization, right? Enhancing the speed and agility of your organization. So that is number 4. Last priority is about purpose, living the purpose, right? Which is becoming an increasingly important topic. Yes, it is cool to have a nicely and beautifully articulated purpose or vision statement, but then you need to live your purpose. And there is a very a good business reason for that, right? If you look at the left-hand side, this is a research looking at the 200 successful and enduring family businesses in Asia. 80% of them are saying that they have a clearly articulated purpose. Right? But then, the duty of CEO and the board will be living the purpose and then also communicating this purpose to employees and investors and consumers. And for that matter, there's more room for Asian companies to improve. If you look at the right-hand side, only 15% of local Asian companies are doing that, right, in their the corporate communication, right? So therefore, there is a scope for Asian companies to strengthen this further. So those were the brief overview of the 5 priorities in Asia in order to build a 21st century company. So this is just a reference point, and hopefully this is just a starting point for you to think about how you build your own 21st century company in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. There are some questions now coming up already, but before those questions, let me go through what you just said. 5 things. Capitalize on data, how to think about sustainability, growth scale,
yep,
speed,
yep,
purpose.
Yes.
So these are the 5 things that the board and the management have to work together to sustain their long-term growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. There are some questions already, and I will read the question for you because the first question comes from Ajahn Banjong. If people think capitalism is harmful, what can we do to the system to alleviate the problems?
Yeah, I can take a first answer at that, and maybe Janvatanavit, if he wants to add. I think, you know, the first point that I started with that showed that people think it's harmful, again, was not necessarily a rejection of capitalism. The reason that I pointed that out is because they're actually shifting their expectations. They want companies to do more. And in the 20th century, you might have said, well, companies are just responding to markets. You can't ask them to do more or less. And today, what we're saying is that CEOs don't get away with that anymore, basically, especially companies that are largely leading market-shaping companies, right? Companies that actually can themselves change a wage in a local market, or themselves create a whole new product like Google did, or that Facebook did, or that WeChat did, that can transform or create a whole nother set of consumer benefits, right? So I think the answer to the question is not to throw away capitalism. That would have been the 20th century answer, I think, for some. You know, that was the basis of a major 20th century conflict. But is rather to say, what does it mean for a company to be aligned with what society needs, right? Because in the long term, if you don't deliver on sustainability, if you don't deliver on strong workforce, you're not going to succeed because you're not going to have the best talent, or you're not going to be able to provide the products that consumers want. And so I think that part of the system, at least the part of the system that we're discussing today, or that this group probably has a great interest in, is about, well, as leading companies, we have agency to shift where society, how society sees companies and the benefits they bring. Jeongmin, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kevin. And then, yeah, you know, no system is perfect, right? So there are challenges with capitalism, right? But then the solution to capitalism could be an improved version of the capitalism, right? And then also, you know, in that, you know, the role of company matters a lot, right? And also, right, and as a leader of the company, you know, you'll probably need to think about, how your role and contribution are evolving. You know, not just simply making money, but also addressing the requests from varying stakeholders. And pandemic is a great example, right? It was a global challenge, societal challenge, humanitarian challenge, and companies played a very, very important role, right, in terms of developing a vaccine in an accelerated manner, sharing the data, developing QR code, right, and also now, I'm in Shanghai on the lockdown. Many companies are sending care packages to their employees, right, and people will remember this, right. So when you help employees in time of needs, and they will remember this, and also will help the company in time of your need.
Okay, wow, thanks. I think what I heard from you is that capitalism is not a bad word, but it has to have purpose.
Yeah.
Purposeful capitalism will address the new expectation from the stakeholders. Yeah.
Hopefully.
Asia, when we talk about Asia, one thing that comes up to my mind is about family business. And family business kind of have a complicated and delicate dynamic by itself. The first generation build it, and the second generation expand, and the third generation may a lot of time we talk about the third generation may be the last generation. So how would you apply that 5 things, the five how-to family business, and to make to recreate the chapter which is the 21st family business company in Asia?
Yeah, Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So Asia has a higher share of family business, right? And then, I would argue that especially for the first four priorities, family business, may have an advantage to drive these priorities, right? So because, they can make a bigger and bolder decision, right? And in terms of resource allocation, right? So many, global companies, they have to go through, multiple layers of decision making and research, right? In terms of, deciding, resource allocation. And then also many companies, they look at what they did before and then copy and paste and then plus 5%, 10%, minus 5%, 10% here and there, right? Because there's a very, very huge organizational inertia, right? But then as a family business owner, right? So if you have a great vision and aspiration, right? Then, you can make a very big, bold movement, right? Across those, right? So, some of the successful businesses, right? Like, semiconductor industry in Asia, for example, they, built their successful, business because of that intuition and big, bold decision making, right? So therefore, arguably, priority 1 to 4, right? So there's a chance for you to act faster, right, and secure advantage, and also number 5, purpose. So that is also arguably even more important in order to build an enduring family business, right? Especially when you pass your business to multiple generations, right? So the successors need to understand why you exist, right? So otherwise, the old businesses may not look cool to the younger generation, and they will not take the button, right? So therefore, why you exist, right? So what do you want to achieve out of your business, right? So therefore, really thinking through the purpose, right? And then constantly reinvent your business will matter more, right, to the family business, and that'll be a more important differentiating factor within the family businesses too.
Thank you, Jeongmin. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
I think just the only thing is, especially on that purpose point, is that the identity of the family business, is often a strength, right? So, and it depends what kind of a company you are, that you need to maintain that even as you transform, right? So if you're what I was calling a deliverer earlier of the 8 types, right? These are companies where there are many touch points with customers, like retail, for example. And, as you're responding to the transformative landscape, somehow that identity of the family business has to persist because customers are trusting in you because of that, right? And that's especially important for a company that has many, many consumer touch points, right? And that's going to be even more important there. Whereas if you're a different type of company, perhaps that identity matters more because of your relationships with other businesses, right? The trusted supplier relationships that have been built up for generations because you're, a builder company and you're the one that other companies depend on. I think that becomes especially important, and you can't lose that identity for a family business. But at the same time, you have in some ways more flexibility to be bold, like Jeongmin was saying.
I heard, Kevin, your word, the word trust. I think it might be the biggest word for now, because to go back to Jeongmin's 5 priority, it's about the winning company in future has to be able to turn data into trust, has to be able to think about sustainability and stakeholders and create trust with them, has to go scale of trust, speed of trust, and articulate your purpose will make a trusting business. So I think that the whole thing is about trust, right?
Yeah. And people don't trust just words, right? So, and I think we often talk about purpose, it's articulating a purpose, but then it's the moments of truth when you have to see whether a company is living up to those words, right? And the pandemic example Jeongmin gave is a good example, right? And that's how people build trust. I also think, by the way, a lot of the same polling that I showed you at the beginning also shows that while capitalism is seen as being, distrusted maybe more than ever. At the same time, business as a whole, compared to governments or other, institutions, is actually still has even more trust than it has historically compared to those others. And we're living in a society where maybe trust is going down. One of the few places people can still look to is a brand or a family business or something that they know and that they do trust, but it does depend on actions.
And that's the whole way of success. Sorry, Jeongmin.
Yeah, I agree, right? So and also, right? So when you want to prove that you are funny, then you don't say you are funny. You just say a joke, right, and make people laugh, right? So therefore, in terms of trust, right,
okay.
No matter how much you say, trust me, right, we value trust, right? What matters is the action, right? So the actual action, right, that companies and board members will actually take and show, right, to the community, right? So that's how you will secure the trust.
Okay, here's another question. Why we are talking about these 5 priorities, the world is changing by itself. The world is shifting, and the geopolitics is shifting. How do you apply? Can we apply that 5 priorities in any situation of the political global politics situation?
Yeah, we think that these 5 priorities are the longer term priorities, right? So geopolitical situation means a lot more uncertainty, right? So that means, right, for the companies who can navigate these uncertainties, right, will emerge even stronger, right? So therefore the gap between winners and losers will become even bigger, right? But then there could be a slightly changing context across those 5, right? So for example, number 1, tech and data, right? So because of the discussion on so-called decoupling, right? So companies may need to think about how to build these multiple systems to cater to the different regulatory environments on data flows and privacy and cybersecurity, etc. Number 2, sustainability, right? So some companies and or economies may want to reduce their dependency, right, on certain geography, right? So that arguably will accelerate the transition, right, toward renewable sources, for example. In that case, you can source more energy from you, right? And the scope of M&A may change, right? So if your attempted deal are subject to the regulatory approvals by different geography, that could change, etc., right? So the uncertainty related to geopolitics may add a bit more uncertainty and the context, right? But then in terms of the priorities, we believe that these are the 5 long-term priorities for companies.
Okay, Kevin, anything to add before the next question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. One of the thing that I think of Asia is family business. Another thing is about the biggest production base in the world is the very important supply chain chunk of the whole world. And OEM, how do that, and how do these 5, can you talk about something that have tangible example of how a typical Asian company, maybe family company, family business, and also supplier of the buyers from the US or Europe, and be a very important part of the whole supply chain. How do they apply these 5 priorities? Any real case or any, you don't have to mention the name, but something tangible.
Yeah, so for example, if you're an automotive company in Asia, right? So first of all, you start as a traditional manufacturing company, right? But then as a manufacturing company, the profit you can capture out of manufacturing will be very, very thin, right? Because the entire industry is shifting toward electric vehicle and autonomous driving and so on, right? So therefore, the software will contribute a lot more, right? So therefore, number one, right? Technology, right? How do I reinvent myself from manufacturing company to become a solution provider, mobility, software, etc. That'll be very critical. And then second, right? So internal combustion engine will disappear, right? So therefore, how do I adopt this, new sources of, fuel, right? Whether that's hydrogen or, other types of, electrical, the energy, etc. That will matter. Number three, in terms of scale, right? Especially, when I want to do vertical integration and as I shift to my to EV, right? Probably I want to, right? Have, the stable supply of battery, which is a very critical source, right? And so, go out for M&A, right? And also some specific, software capability, AI, etc. I also go ahead and, buy those companies, etc. And number five, purpose, right? I need to think clearly about, my new purpose. It is not just about, producing a car. It is more about helping people solving their, needs to, right, related to mobility, and at the same time save the world, right? So, all of this will still be very relevant to a very, very typical manufacturing-oriented company in Asia.
Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I'd just give maybe the example of, the technology supply chains. I'm thinking, for example, in hardware, where you think back to that map I showed and where the stakeholder relationships hold value, right, for a company. And so for a company upstream in the supply chain, that relationship with that large customer-facing, perhaps giant technology firm is especially important. And, the reason we're saying respond to stakeholder expectations is not to just, do charity for the world. It's to create joint value. That's where your company's future's value is tied to, right? So one of the things that I've seen is that, some of those upstream suppliers are actually interested in the societal priorities of that downstream company, because it's their brand value in the world that is actually facing customer expectations. And so they need to be aligned with the sustainability goals or the workforce goals of that downstream company. And that supply chain relationship in the other direction becomes the most valuable relationship they have. And one of the things that's happening is they now have to ask the question, what are the kind of purpose and societal priorities of that downstream company? And so that's just one example that I've seen of in the technology supply chain.
Okay. Oh, we are 2 minutes away from the end. So would any of you or both of you want to leave something? What is one thing that would be key takeaway from you to the audience today? Kevin, start with you.
Yeah, no, I think 1 point, but in 2 parts. So one is that there's more value in stakeholder relationships maybe than there has been, especially because there's more scrutiny put on them. But 2, it really depends on what kind of company you are, what those relationships are going to be. And societal impact is only tied to business impact if you're truly using your core capabilities. And that depends on how you create value and what kind of company you are. So it's not something separate, that is your societal impact. It is what kind of business you are that should be linking to that, because that's where long-term value for business and society comes from.
Thank you. Okay. Jeongmin?
Yeah, so my closing thought is have a long-term view, right? So-called through cycle view, through cycle mindset, right? So there'll be always uncertainty in the world and ups and downs and crises and so on. Winning companies, they have the through cycle mindset. So when the cycle is down, they still keep investing for the future. So when the crisis is over, they are the ones, who are ready to, take the opportunity, right, from the recovering economy, right, with the long-term perspective, right? That's what's needed for companies in Asia.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot. We learned a lot. Let me summarize what we learned. Well, Firstly, there are 5 priorities in order to win in future. But the winning in future is to win together. Especially in Asia, we are the big chunk of the supply chain. So it's about supply chain of trust. And this supply chain of trust can be achieved through thinking about that 5 priority, capitalize on data, thinking about sustainability, growth scale, speed, and purpose. And that's how we create, to Kevin's point, joint value. And no matter how the business landscape change, no matter how geopolitical landscape change, if the board and the management stick with these 5 priorities and re-examine it, maybe I think what is changing about that 5 priorities is that you have to re-examine that more often.
Yeah.
Right? So that is the holy grail is about collective winning. Okay.
Yeah.
With that, I would like to close this session by thanking Mr. Jeongmin, Seong, and Mr. Kevin Russell. And thanks everyone, the audience, for listening. And thank you, Indorama Venture Public Company Limited, for your support. Our next activities are director briefing on leadership that shapes the future. Leadership that shapes the future by Kun Ken Nakarin. As you know that he has been a host and he has been asking all the talented business people and business leaders. I would like to ask him instead, what has he picked up in previous interview? What does he mean by leadership that shapes the future? So that will be on the 12th of May. So meanwhile, stay safe and please scan this QR code for your opinion of this session. Okay, we need your opinion. Okay, thank you very much indeed. สวัสดีครับ